Why would the United States and Iran choose Versailles? Of all the places in the world, why here? Because sometimes the most important part of an agreement isn't what's written on the paper. It's where that paper is signed. For most people, Versailles is simply a palace, an architectural masterpiece, a museum filled with gold, mirrors, and tourists carrying cameras. But in geopolitics, Versailles is something entirely different.
It is one of the few places on Earth where history never really ended. Every corridor, every room, every window still carries the weight of decisions that shaped the 20th century. And that's what makes today's story so fascinating. Because when diplomats choose Versailles, they aren't only choosing a location, they're choosing history itself. If you wanted to understand power, you might begin with armies, aircraft carriers,
missile systems, military alliances. You could measure GDP, oil production, trade. All of those things matter, but none of them explain everything. Because power isn't only physical. Sometimes power is psychological. Sometimes power is symbolic. And sometimes power is nothing more than the story people choose to believe. Think about a map. Some places matter because of geography. The Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal. Tiny pieces of geography that influence the movement of billions of dollars every single day. Economists call them choke points, because when something passes through a narrow passage, whoever influences that passage influences the system. History works the same way, except instead of controlling ships, certain places control meaning. Certain places become so saturated with historical memory that every new event passing through them inherits part of that memory. Versailles is one of those places. That is why, when news emerged that a diplomatic agreement between the United States and Iran had been signed in Versailles, many observers immediately focused on something unexpected. Not the clauses, not the legal language, not even the political concessions. They focused on the location. Why Versailles? Why not Geneva? Why not Vienna? Why not New York? Why choose perhaps the most symbolically loaded diplomatic location in modern history? Because locations communicate, sometimes more effectively than speeches. To understand why, we have to travel back more than a century, back to a Europe that barely existed anymore. In 1918, the First World War finally came to an end. More than 16 million people had died. Entire cities had disappeared. Generations had been lost, and 4 of the world's greatest empires had collapsed almost simultaneously. The German Empire, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, Imperial Russia. For centuries, they had shaped international politics. Within only a few years, they were gone. Europe wasn't rebuilding. It was reinventing itself. Inside the Palace of Versailles, world leaders gathered to answer one impossible question. How do you create peace after the largest war humanity had ever witnessed? The answer seemed straightforward. Write a treaty, redraw borders, assign responsibility, build a new international order.
But history rarely follows simple plans, because the people sitting around that negotiating table
didn't agree on what peace actually meant. France had spent decades fearing another German invasion. Its priority was security. Germany had to become incapable of threatening Europe ever again. Britain saw things differently. A completely broken Germany could destabilize the entire continent. Balance mattered more than revenge. And the United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, imagined something entirely new. Instead of another European balance of power, America proposed international cooperation. Rules instead of rivalry. Institutions instead of endless wars. 3 visions, 3 definitions of peace, compressed into one agreement, one signature, one palace. At the time, many believed they were ending history's greatest conflict. Instead, they were creating one of history's greatest debates. Because treaties don't simply divide territory, they divide memory. For France, Versailles represented justice. For Britain, it represented compromise. For many Germans, it represented humiliation. The same document, the same signatures, the same building, yet 3 completely different interpretations. And that may be the most important lesson Versailles ever taught us. History isn't only about what happened, it's about how people remember what happened. History has a strange habit. It doesn't stay in the past. Sometimes it keeps negotiating long after the diplomats have gone home. Versailles is one of those stories. Because when the treaty was signed in 1919, many believed they had secured peace. Instead, they had created one of the most powerful political symbols of the 20th century. At first, the Treaty of Versailles looked like a legal document. Hundreds of pages, reparations, territorial changes, military restrictions, international guarantees. On paper, it was simply an agreement. But politics is rarely driven by paper. Politics is driven by stories, and stories are driven by emotion. Inside Germany, the treaty quickly stopped being discussed as law. It became something much larger, a national memory. Factories were struggling. Inflation destroyed savings. Millions felt abandoned by the political system. Economic hardship demanded an explanation. Versailles became that explanation. Not because every economic problem came directly from the treaty, but because it offered something politics desperately needs: a simple story. Simple stories spread faster than complicated truths. They humiliated us. They weakened us. They stole our future. Whether every claim was historically accurate almost stopped mattering. Because once people believe a symbol, that symbol begins creating its own reality. This is something political scientists understand remarkably well. Facts influence policy, but narratives influence people. And people elect governments, support revolutions, accept wars, or reject them. By the early 1930s, Versailles had become more than history. It had become political currency. Every speech returned to it. Every campaign referenced it. Every promise pointed toward it. Not because citizens had memorized the treaty, but because they had absorbed its symbolism.
That is the extraordinary power of historical memory. People don't need to remember every detail. They only need to remember how something made them feel. That emotional memory became one of the most powerful tools available to extremist politics. Again and again, Versailles was presented as proof.
Proof that Germany had been betrayed. Proof that the international system was unfair. Proof that national greatness had been stolen. Whether those arguments reflected the full historical reality is still debated today, but politically, they were extraordinarily effective because symbols don't compete with facts. They compete with emotions, and emotions usually win. This is why historians often say the First World War ended in 1918.
But the political consequences of Versailles continued for decades. Some historians even argue that the peace conference planted conditions that contributed to future instability. Not because one treaty alone caused another world war. History is never that simple. But because the treaty became one part of a much larger political story, one that different leaders interpreted and used in very different ways. This is where Versailles becomes something larger than diplomacy. It becomes infrastructure. Not physical infrastructure, narrative infrastructure. A place where history continues producing meaning, generation after generation. Think about it this way. Some cities become financial centers, others become military centers. Versailles became something rarer, a symbolic center. A place where every future political event carries invisible historical baggage. That baggage cannot be seen. It cannot be photographed, but everyone feels it. Diplomats, journalists, historians, even ordinary citizens. Which brings us back to today. Because when an agreement is signed inside Versailles, the document enters a building that already contains more than a century of political memory. And memory changes interpretation. Two identical agreements signed in two different cities will not necessarily be perceived in the same way. The words may remain identical. The symbolism does not. That's because locations communicate, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally, sometimes simply because history refuses to leave them alone. Versailles is one of those places. No government controls its symbolism anymore. No diplomat owns its history. Yet every leader who walks through its halls inherits part of that story, whether they want to or not. So perhaps the real question was never what was written inside the agreement. Perhaps the more interesting question is, what message does the location send before anyone even opens the document? Because in geopolitics, perception is often the first battlefield, and sometimes it becomes the most important one. So, why does any of this matter today? After all, the world of 1919 no longer exists. Empires are gone. Borders have changed. The Cold War has come and gone. The global balance of power looks completely different. So why are we still talking about Versailles? Because history doesn't disappear. It accumulates. Every generation leaves behind more than buildings. It leaves behind symbols. And symbols have a remarkable ability to survive long after the people who created them are gone. In international politics, every decision communicates something, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. The words spoken at a press conference matter. The flags behind the podium matter. The order in which leaders shake hands matters. Even where they stand for a photograph can become part of the story, because diplomacy isn't only negotiation, it's theater. Every image, every location, every detail can influence how millions of people interpret an event. That's why places like Geneva, Vienna, New York, or Versailles carry meanings beyond geography. They've hosted conferences, negotiations, peace talks, historic decisions. Over time, they've become symbols of diplomacy itself. But Versailles is different, unlike Geneva, which represents neutrality, or New York, which represents global institutions. Versailles carries the memory of a world that was rebuilt after catastrophe. It reminds people that diplomacy often begins only after unimaginable destruction. And that's what makes symbolic locations so powerful. They don't change the legal meaning of an agreement, but they can shape its public perception. A treaty signed in one city may be interpreted differently than the exact same treaty signed somewhere else. Not because the words changed, but because the story surrounding those words changed. Political psychologists have studied this for decades. Human beings rarely evaluate information in isolation. We interpret new events through old memories, through familiar symbols, through historical analogies. When people hear the word Munich, many think of appeasement. When they hear Pearl Harbor, they think of surprise attacks. When they hear Berlin, they think of division and reunification. And when they hear Versailles, they often think of peace, punishment, and the fragile balance between justice and resentment. The location itself becomes part of the message. This is why diplomacy is never just about what governments intend. It's also about what audiences perceive. Citizens, journalists, markets, all of them interpret the same event through different lenses. Some see compromise, others see weakness, others see opportunity. The agreement may be identical, the interpretations rarely are. And that brings us to a larger idea, one that goes far beyond Versailles. Because this isn't really a story about France, or Europe, or even one diplomatic agreement. It's a story about power, the different forms that power can take. Military power, economic power, technological power, and symbolic power. The power to shape how events are remembered. Because memory can influence politics just as profoundly as geography. Think back to one of the world's most important maritime routes, the Strait of Hormuz. Unlike Versailles, Hormuz doesn't derive its importance from history. It derives its importance from geography, a narrow waterway, just a few dozen kilometers across at its narrowest point. Yet, a significant share of the world's seaborne oil exports passes through it every day. If that passage is disrupted, energy prices react, markets react, governments react. Geography creates leverage. Versailles creates a different kind of leverage, not over ships, not over oil, but over interpretation. One shapes the movement of resources, The other shapes the movement of ideas. One is physical, the other is psychological.
Yet both demonstrate the same principle. Sometimes, the world's most powerful forces are concentrated in surprisingly small places. And that leads to an even bigger question. If a single palace can influence how the world interprets diplomacy, what happens when a narrow stretch of water influences how the world accesses energy? What if one of the most strategic waterways on Earth had never belonged to Iran? Would global oil markets look the same? Would sanctions have carried the same weight? Would diplomacy in the Middle East have evolved differently? Would the balance of power we know today even exist? Because if Versailles teaches us that history creates symbolic choke points, then the Strait of Hormuz reminds us that geography creates strategic choke points. And sometimes, a few kilometers can change the calculations of the entire world. In our next episode, we'll ask one of the biggest geopolitical what-if questions of the modern era. What if Iran had never controlled the Strait of Hormuz? Because understanding today's world sometimes begins with imagining the one that never existed.